Welcome to Dystopia Today, the show that explores the darker side of current events and society. In today's episode, we'll be talking about corruption within the United States federal government. Corruption is a term that's thrown around a lot, but what does it really mean when it comes to the U.S. government? At its most basic level, corruption is the abuse of power for personal gain. It's the use of one's position to further one's own interests rather than the public's interests. And unfortunately, this is something that we see in many areas of our government. Let's start by looking at lobbying. Lobbyists are paid to influence government policy on behalf of their clients. But too often, their efforts are focused on serving the interests of big corporations and the wealthy rather than everyday citizens. There are countless examples of lobbyists successfully pushing for policies that benefit their clients at the expense of the public. For example, the pharmaceutical industry spends millions of dollars each year lobbying Congress to protect their interests. In 2018, the industry spent over $280 million on lobbying efforts. One of the most high-profile examples of this lobbying is the fight over prescription drug prices. Another area where corruption is evident is in campaign finance. The cost of running for office is extremely high, and candidates need funding to compete. This has led to a system where politicians rely heavily on donations from wealthy individuals and special interest groups. As a result, some argue that elected officials are beholden to their donors rather than their constituents. One specific example of campaign finance in the United States is the Citizens United v. FEC Supreme Court case in 2010. The case centered on a political action committee called Citizens United, which had produced a film critical of Hillary Clinton, then a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. The Federal Election Commission argued that the film was essentially an in-kind contribution to the campaign and therefore subject to campaign finance laws, which would require the PAC to disclose its donors. Citizens United, on the other hand, argued that the film was protected under the First Amendment's freedom of speech clause and that the PAC should not be required to disclose its donors. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Citizens United, ruling that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting political spending by corporations and unions. This decision opened the floodgates for unlimited spending by corporations and other interest groups in political campaigns, leading to the rise of super PACs and the so-called dark money that can be difficult to trace to its source. Critics argue that this decision has allowed wealthy individuals and corporations to have an outsized influence on the political process and has led to a system in which politicians are beholden to big donors rather than their constituents. Nepotism is another concern. In the case of Bernie Sanders, there were allegations of nepotism involving his wife, Jane Sanders, during his 2016 presidential campaign. It was reported that Jane Sanders had been hired by her husband's campaign as a media buyer, even though she had little experience in the field. Additionally, it was alleged that she had secured a loan for the now-defunct Burlington College, of which she was the president, and used Bernie Sanders' congressional office to lobby for the loan. An investigation was launched by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Vermont into whether Jane Sanders had committed bank fraud in relation to the loan. However, in 2018, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced that it had closed the investigation and would not be bringing charges. This example highlights the potential conflicts of interest that can arise when family members of politicians are involved in their campaigns or hold positions of power. In light of the Trump administration, some argue that President Trump's appointment of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, as a senior advisor to the president was an example of nepotism, given Kushner's lack of prior government experience. Hunter Biden is another example. He was a board member of a Ukrainian energy company while his father, Joe Biden, was vice president of the United States. Critics have argued that Hunter Biden was given the position because of his family's political connections. Finally, there's the issue of private sector influence. The revolving door between the public and private sectors in the U.S. can lead to corruption as individuals move back and forth between government jobs and private sector jobs, potentially using their government positions to benefit their future employers or vice versa. During the 2008 financial crisis, Elizabeth Warren was a law professor and chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel, tasked with overseeing the Troubled Asset Relief Program bailout. Warren became a prominent voice in criticizing the government's handling of the bailout, calling for greater transparency and accountability. However, after she was elected to the Senate in 2012, Warren received criticism for her vote in favor of the 2015 omnibus spending bill, which included a provision rolling back regulations on the banking industry. Critics pointed out that Warren had received significant campaign donations from the financial industry and argued that her vote was influenced by these donations. This example highlights the potential for private sector influence on public officials, even those who are seen as champions of government reform. Warren's vote in favor of the omnibus bill, which ran counter to her previous calls for greater accountability in the financial industry, raises questions about the extent to which campaign donations can influence the actions of elected officials. The dystopian implications of corruption in government are numerous and far-reaching. When government officials are corrupt, they are no longer serving the public interest, but their own interests or the interests of powerful special interests. This can lead to a breakdown of trust between citizens and government, eroding the legitimacy of democratic institutions. Corruption can also lead to a concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a small elite, further exacerbating social and economic inequality. This can lead to a situation where the few at the top control the majority of resources, leaving the rest of the population struggling to get by. In a dystopian scenario, corruption can also lead to a breakdown of the rule of law and the emergence of a lawless state where the powerful can act with impunity, while the weak are left to suffer. This can create a culture of fear and a sense of hopelessness among citizens. In extreme cases, corruption can also lead to the erosion of basic human rights and freedoms, as the government becomes more focused on maintaining power and suppressing dissent than on protecting the rights of its citizens. In a worst-case scenario, the government would be completely beholden to the interests of large corporations and wealthy donors, with little regard for the needs and desires of the general public. This could lead to a situation where government policies are designed to benefit corporations and the ultra-wealthy at the expense of everyone else. For example, there may be a lack of regulations on corporations that result in environmental degradation, workplace exploitation, or unsafe products, all in the name of profit. The government may be incentivized to prioritize the interests of corporations over the well-being of its citizens, leading to a lack of access to healthcare, education, and other basic services. Additionally, there could be a lack of transparency and accountability, with corruption and conflicts of interest running rampant in government. This could lead to a situation where government officials and political elites are able to enrich themselves at the expense of the general public, with little to no repercussions. In such a scenario, the government may use its power to suppress dissent and maintain the status quo, using tactics such as propaganda and media control to control the narrative and limit public outrage. The general public may feel helpless to effect change, leading to a sense of hopelessness and a loss of faith in the democratic process. Overall, the worst-case scenario of government taking corporate dollars would be a dystopian world where the interests of the few outweigh the needs of the many, with little hope for change or progress. Corruption in government can have severe and lasting consequences for society, creating a dystopian world where the rule of law, democracy, and human rights are undermined or non-existent. So, what can be done about corruption within the government? Some argue for stricter lobbying and campaign finance regulations. Others suggest term limits for elected officials or a more transparent government. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but it's important to continue the conversation and hold our government accountable. That's it for today's episode of Dystopia Today. We hope you found this discussion informative and thought-provoking. If you want to learn more about the show, make sure to check out our social media links in the description. And as always, stay vigilant and stay informed. Now lo-fi.